Okay, hello, welcome to lesson 10. This is a very short module. So this addresses endpoint security. Now we've talked about cloud, we've talked about network. Now we're talking about endpoints. And anytime, I think in one of the previous lessons, I talked about what constitutes a network. I said a network is two or more devices connected to share resources, and a resource can be anything. It can be mail server, it can be files, it can be internet, it can be drives. That's to say, it can be hardware, it can be typically anything. Once you have more than one device and they are connected, they want to share resources, that's a network. That's a simplistic definition of what a network is, right? And that network is made up of 3 points. The endpoint devices, that is the items that are trying to connect. That is your phone, your printer, your, what's it called? Your PCs, your cameras, all of those things are the end devices. Then the intermediary devices, those are the routers, the switches, the access point. Then the connecting media. The connecting media is how do you connect? That is your cables, your fiber optics, your Ethernet, your Bluetooth, your wireless. So those are these 3 things that makes up a network: endpoint devices or end devices, connecting media, and intermediary devices. So, but for here, we're trying to look at endpoint security. So anytime you hear the word endpoint, you're talking about those printers, those phones, those PCs, those tablets, right? So we want to actually assess their capacity. Now, for the very first part, we're going to be looking at 10A, which is implement endpoint security. So how do you implement endpoint security? One first thing you want to do is to make sure you harden them, right? So for you to harden them, for operating systems, for instance, your endpoint devices are going to be your workstations, they're going to be your servers. So what are some of your baselines? The interfaces, that is your ports, right? All of your ports that you have on that device, you want to make sure that they are hardened, whether it's your USB, whether it's going to be your Ethernet port. Those ports, you want to make sure that they are secure. That's why I see some companies are going to implement systems, firewall systems, or a complete endpoint solution that will make sure that people cannot insert maybe a pen drive or a hard drive. It's not going to work, right? So all of your interfaces or your Ethernet port, you want to make sure that you have full control of that. All of the services running on your network, the port numbers, the storage, all of these are going to serve as baseline of what you want to configure. Now, one of the things you can do is to do segmentation. I've talked about segmentation in this series, and I said, if you put everything in one place, you're going to have one single point of failure. It's like having just having one access to an entire football stadium. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We can say, okay, the VIP are going to access from this point. The players are going to access from this point. The guys, spectators are going to access from this point. Officials are going to access from this point. You kind of segment everything. Same thing when it comes to endpoint protection. You don't want to put C-level executives, critical IT infrastructure, visitors, consultants. You don't want to put everything in one point and have everything just go into one switch or one router. You want to segment. So it provides better security. It provides better management for your enterprise. As you want to also isolate, you want to have antivirus and anti-malware. You want to make sure that your disks are encrypted. You want to have a kind of a patch management program. That's to say, you want to have a routine. You want to have a documented process where you're going to say, okay, at every point in time, every 6 months, every 2 months, every 3 months, depending on what works best for you or what your risks are after you've evaluated them, we want to make sure that we update or we upgrade. Now, for advanced endpoint protection, some of the things you're going to be looking at are, do you want to do EDR, or do you want to do XDR, or do you want to do HIDS, HIPS? I talked about this in the previous module. Or do you want to go a little bit advanced and do a UEBA, right? So all of these are options that you have to protect your endpoints, like your desktop, your laptops, your smartphones, your tablets. I have noted some options. If you want to use an endpoint detection response, You can use CrowdStrike by Falcon. You can use Carbon Black. You can use Microsoft Defender. If you want to go for XDR, you can go for Palo Alto. You could go for Trend. You could go for Cisco's SecureX. If you want to go for HIDS or HIPS, you could go for any of these options. If you want to go for something a little bit more advanced, right? I normally prefer Microsoft Sentinel and CrowdStrike Falcon, but CrowdStrike Falcon is a little bit more detailed. If you've used any of these two, and it depends on what works best for you based on budgets, what your goals are, and what your use case is all about. So in this case, you're not just trying to protect the individual items. You want to control and protect the entire infrastructure. So you do your implementation and you want to see all your USBs, you want to see threats, you want to see intrusions, you want to see everything from one point. That's what an advanced endpoint protection grants to you. And that's what some of these softwares, they can offer you. You can pause the video, make your notes, and if you have questions, don't forget to use the comment section. And most of these companies, they offer trial versions. So this is something you could try even on just a small network of 2, 3, 4 systems. And you could do a trial version of this software and see what and what you can control, what and what you can protect, what you can have access to. Okay, let's look at endpoint configuration. So some of the things you want to do is to make sure you follow the principle of least privilege, right? So you don't want to grant people access more than they should have. You want to make sure that you have an access control list. I've talked about this a time without number. You want to have file system permissions. Like most operating systems have a way to do file permissions, whether you're running whatever operating system that you run. There you want to have, even your access control list is going to allow you to have some kind of what is permitted by social user or type of group and what is not permissible. And you can use group policy to kind of enforce some of this. Okay, so some of the hardening techniques are protecting the physical ports, making sure that you have encryption. So you see this encryption now is across different attack surfaces. The disks, the externals, your network, your email. Same thing applies for your web. But here now, remember, we're talking about endpoint. So that's why you don't see anything that has to do with cloud or web here. Here, we're just talking about the endpoint devices that we have within our network, right? We want to remove unnecessary softwares because just my phone, I think this morning, I saw a notification and said, okay, so app, you've not used them for the last 2 months. So because when a software is not being used or a software is not regularly updated, that is an inroad. That's why at times a rule of thumb of knowing which kind of software to use is software that is always updated. So it's a good thing because for a software that is updated, that means you have a lot of patch free compared to a software that is updated once in a blue moon. Now, there are some specialized devices, especially devices that are used at industry capacity, industry level. Now, for very, very developed cities, they're going to have what we call industrial control systems. Take, for instance, gas, petrol, what's it called? Or for very large factories, they're going to centrally control most of these things. And if they're going to centrally control most of these things, they will use some standards. And you can look up embedded and RTOs. They are, and these have a lot of application even in healthcare. You know, like things that are going to monitor heartbeats. If you get into a hospital now, the hospital is going to have some kind of pump machine, some things that's going to monitor your heartbeat. Those guys are going to use real-time operating system. At times, some stopwatch, they use those kind of operating systems. Some of them are Linux-based operating systems, or what's going to be monitoring different parts of your bodies, right? So these are specialized devices, and it calls for what? protection, and the vendors' guidelines for protection can be looked at. So you have ICS, then you have SCADA. So this is industrial control systems. Like I said, for industries, most of the times, like at times for some cities, their water is central, their gas is central. So those hardware that protect most of these things, like energy, water treatment, transportation, they come handy. They use most of this protocol, most of these guidelines for maintenance. So this also calls for hardening, because there are some, especially for state-sponsored hackers, they can look up to some of these devices and see if there are vulnerabilities. So we looked at endpoint hardening, endpoint protection, advanced endpoint protection, endpoint configuration, hardening techniques, hardening specialized devices. We said some of the ways you can do that is by doing a thorough hardening. Look at the vendor, like Windows, like Linux, like those vendors of those tools and those machines are going to tell you, okay, this is a way to keep this thing secured. Either you are patching, you are updating, or you are adding some modules to them. And you can also use group policies to do that. Now let's look at mobile device hardening. It's also an endpoint device. Now, there are several models here I want to talk about. I want to talk about BYOD, CBO, COPE, CYOP, OD. For exams, you should be able to differentiate these different models, right? Because the kind of model a particular enterprise is using is going to tell how secure they can be. Mobile devices are very prone to physical loss and theft. And some companies are going to allow their employees to bring in their devices. Some you're not allowed. I remember a company we were consulting for like 4 or 5 years between 2010 and I think 15, thereabout. The company had a policy that you can't bring, let's say, a hard drive or a pen drive. You can't bring any of such. The CEO was telling me something. They had a malware attack as a result of this, and they spent millions to be able to do backups, to be able to retrieve their files and all of that. And they now had that policy. So the policy is going to shape what is allowed and what is not allowed, and also shape how well or how you should harden the devices you have on the network. So some companies are going to also have mobile device management softwares. Microsoft have, a lot of vendors have, so that you can, especially if you give devices to employees, you can be able to shut down that device. You can be able to do backup. You can be able to retrieve the files remotely. For iOS, there are several levels of encryption. You have all user data on the device is always encrypted. Email data and any apps using data protection options are subject to a second round of encryption. In iOS, data protection is enabled automatically when you configure a password lock on the device. So this is just for your information. Okay. Now, location service is because imagine if somebody gets hold of a device, he can be able to tell all your itinerary. So for mobile device hardening, there are some concepts you need to be aware of. You have global positioning, that is GPS. You have indoor positioning system, IP. The GPS is a little bit more popular, and the geofencing, where you are saying, okay, this device cannot be used far more than this particular radius. Then you have geotagging. But one thing when it comes to location services is privacy. That's why it's always good to make sure that your location is turned on, because if a device is gotten and the location, of course, that email or whatever is going to still be signed on, you can still tell all of the points, all of the places the person have been, and that can be a vulnerability. Okay. Nothing much yet. So for mobile devices, they usually they default to Wi-Fi connections. So at times it can be home, it can be enterprise, it can be rogue or evil twin network. We talked about this when we discussed honeypots. So PANs is when you have two devices, maybe connecting just at very close range. You have other ways connectivity can be done is an ad hoc Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi direct, or just do a tethering hotspot. So we've looked at mobile hardening, device encryption, location service, cellular and GPS connection methods, Wi-Fi and tethering connection methods, how well connection can be done. And I think this is missing, kind of. I think these two guys are missing from the slide, these two guys. So it's a long time that I remember, let's say 14 years ago, then when the Wi-Fi technology, it was still 2G networks. Most of the times you could use Bluetooth to connect maybe from phones to PCs and have internet access when dial-up was still very popular. Then for near fields, NFC, near field communications, is just this kind of a signal you have on your phone, something that looks like this. Sorry, a moment. So something that looks like this. It looks like this on your ATM card. You see something like this, right? So anytime you see that stuff, that is the NFC. That means that card have the NFC feature, right? You can use that card to do that kind of communication. Of course, it can store some kilobyte of data, and it can be used. Some hospitals use it. Some access control system does use it. Some bus service use it. And at times, some mobile payment companies, they use that for communication. So I think these are all the points you need to take note for your exams for a mobile security. Okay, so we've talked about endpoint capabilities, and I'm going to see you, endpoint security capabilities, and I'm going to see you in module 11.